Subscribe to my YouTube channel for deeply emotional, romantic, and mature stories that echo through your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support meaningful storytelling. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Sarah's modest two-story home, creating a symphony that had become her evening companion over the past 3 years. At 42, she had grown accustomed to the quiet that filled her house after her 18-year-old son, Marcus, left for college. Silence wasn't unwelcome, it was peaceful, predictable. But tonight, something felt different. Sarah wrapped her silk robe tighter around her shoulders as she descended the stairs, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9:30, and she wondered, who could possibly be visiting at this hour? Through the frosted glass of her front door, she could make out the silhouette of a tall figure, shoulders hunched against the rain. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. "Mrs. Chum?" The voice was deeper than she remembered, rougher around the edges. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I didn't know where else to go." David Martinez stood on her doorstep, water dripping from his dark hair, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something vulnerable and raw. Sarah had watched this young man grow up alongside her son, had seen him transform from a gangly teenager into the 20-year-old man who now stood before her, his eyes holding a pain she recognized all too well. "David? My goodness, you're soaked through." Sarah stepped aside, her maternal instincts overriding the flutter of something unexpected in her chest. "Come in, please." "What's wrong?" He hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing into her home might change everything. And perhaps it would. "I know Marcus is away at college," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I just needed to talk to someone who would understand." Sarah's heart clenched. She had known David since he was 8 years old, had watched him navigate his parents' bitter divorce, had seen him struggle to find his place in the world. There was something about him that had always tugged at her heartstrings, a quiet strength, mixed with an underlying loneliness that mirrored her own. "Of course," she said softly, closing the door behind him. "Let me get you a towel." As she handed him the fluffy white towel, their fingers brushed, and Sarah felt an electric jolt that she quickly pushed aside. This was Marcus's best friend, she reminded herself. The boy she had driven to soccer practice countless times, the teenager who had spent countless evenings at their dinner table. But as she watched him run the towel through his hair, she couldn't ignore the fact that David wasn't that boy anymore. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know this is weird, showing up here like this. But my dad, he's getting married again. 3rd time." He let out a bitter laugh. "And my mom, she's moving to Portland with her new boyfriend. It's like everyone's just moving on, you know? Like the past 20 years meant nothing." Sarah's chest tightened with empathy. She knew exactly what he meant. After her divorce from Marcus's father, she had felt that same sense of displacement. That feeling of being left behind while everyone else seemed to know exactly where they were going. "Sit down," she said gently, guiding him to the couch in her living room. "I'll make us some tea." As she busied herself in the kitchen, Sarah tried to steady her racing thoughts. David had always been special to her, not just as Marcus's friend, but as someone who had shown her son what loyalty and genuine friendship looked like. But tonight, there was something different in the way he looked at her, something that made her pulse quicken in a way she hadn't felt in years. When she returned with 2 steaming mugs, David had removed his wet jacket and was sitting with his head in his hands. The lamplight cast golden shadows across his face, highlighting the strong jaw and defined cheekbones that had replaced the soft features of youth. "Here," Sarah said, settling beside him on the couch, careful to maintain her Respectable distance. Tell me what's really bothering you. David took the mug with a grateful smile, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the gentle patter of rain against the windows. I feel like I'm stuck, David finally said, his voice thick with emotion. Everyone else is moving forward, starting new chapters, and I'm just here, working at the garage, living in that tiny apartment above Miller's Deli, watching everyone else's lives unfold while mine stays exactly the same. Sarah's heart ached for him. She remembered that feeling so well, the sense of being trapped in a life that no longer fit, of watching time pass while feeling powerless to change anything. You're 20 years old, she said softly. You have your whole life ahead of you. This isn't the end of your story, David. It's barely the beginning. He turned to look at her then, and Sarah felt her breath catch. His eyes, which had always been kind, now held a depth that spoke of pain and longing and something else she couldn't quite name. How do you do it? He asked quietly. How do you keep going when everything feels so ... Empty? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah realized that this wasn't just about his parents' life changes. This was about something deeper, something that had been building for a long time. Some days are harder than others, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I've learned that emptiness isn't permanent. It's just waiting to be filled with something better. David set down his mug and turned to face her fully. Mrs. Chen. Sarah, he corrected himself, and the use of her first name sent a shiver down her spine. Can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. I've been in love with you since I was 16 years old. The words hung in the air like a confession at a cathedral, sacred and dangerous and impossible to take back. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed what he had just said. David, she whispered, her voice shaking. You don't mean that? I do, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. I know it's crazy. I know it's wrong, but I can't pretend anymore. Not tonight. Not when I'm sitting here with you, and you're looking at me like maybe you feel it too. Sarah's mind reeled. She thought of all the times she had caught herself watching David when he was at their house. All the moments when his laugh had made her smile in a way that felt too intimate for a friend of her son's. She thought of how she had noticed the way his shoulders had broadened, how his voice had deepened, how his eyes had begun to hold secrets. This is impossible, she said, but even as she spoke the words, she couldn't bring herself to move away from him. I know, David said, his voice rough with emotion. But impossible doesn't mean it's not real. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of his confession settling between them like a bridge they weren't sure they should cross. The rain outside had intensified, creating a cocoon of intimacy around them. I should go, David said. Finally, but he made no move to leave. Should you? Sarah asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Their eyes met again, and this time, Sarah didn't look away. She saw the man David had become, saw the genuine love in his eyes, saw the way he was trying to be respectful even as his heart was breaking. I don't want to complicate your life, he said softly. I don't want to ruin what we have. What do we have? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. David reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jawline. I don't know, he admitted, but I know it's real. I know it's been growing for years, and I know that when I'm with you, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Sarah closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite every rational thought screaming at her to stop. When she opened them again, She saw her own longing reflected in his gaze. "This is crazy," she whispered. "Maybe," David said, his voice tender. "But maybe crazy is exactly what we both need." He leaned closer, and Sarah felt the world narrow to just this moment, this choice, this impossible possibility. She could smell his cologne mixed with rain, could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the way his eyes searched hers for permission. "If we do this," she said quietly, "there's no going back. Everything changes." "Maybe it's time for things to change," David replied, his forehead nearly touching hers. Sarah thought of her empty house, of the years she had spent convincing herself that she was content with solitude. She thought of David's loneliness, of the way he had always looked at her with something deeper than friendship. She thought of all the reasons why this was wrong, and then she thought of all the reasons why it felt so right. "Your son," she whispered, the words a final barrier between them. "Marcus wants us both to be happy," David said gently. "He's told me that 100 times. Maybe he'll understand." Sarah knew that was wishful thinking, but in this moment, with David so close, she could feel his breath on her lips. The rest of the world seemed very far away. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," David said, his hand moving to cup her face. "But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." The kiss, when it came, was gentle and tender, and full of years of suppressed longing. Sarah felt something inside her that had been dormant for so long suddenly spring to life, like a flower blooming after a long winter dot when they broke apart. Both breathing heavily, Sarah saw her own amazement reflected in David's eyes. He whispered, his thumb tracing her lower lip. "Wow," Sarah agreed, her voice shaky. They sat in silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, and the clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking time in a world that suddenly felt full of possibility. "What happens now?" David asked, his voice uncertain. Sarah looked at this young man, who had just turned her world upside down, who had shown her that her heart was capable of feeling things she had thought were lost forever. She thought of all the complications that lay ahead, all the difficult conversations and uncertain futures. But she also thought of the way he looked at her, like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She thought of the gentleness in his touch, the sincerity in his voice, the way he had been brave enough to tell her the truth, even when it could have cost him everything. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I know that I haven't felt this alive in years." David smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise after the longest night. "Then maybe that's enough for now," he said, pulling her closer. As Sarah settled into his embrace, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to recapture the past, but the gentle hope of someone ready to embrace an uncertain but beautiful future. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean and preparing it for whatever came next. And inside, two hearts that had been lonely for far too long finally found their way to each other, against all odds and despite all obstacles. The story of Sarah and David was just beginning, and neither of them knew where it would lead. But as they held each other in the soft lamplight, surrounded by the quiet comfort of home, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The clock chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. And, with it, the beginning of a love story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. Some love stories begin with a thunderclap, sudden and overwhelming. Others start with a whisper, soft and gradual. But the best love stories, Sarah realized as she felt David's heart beating against her chest, begin with honesty, the courage to admit what you feel, even when it seems impossible. As the night stretched on, they talked about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears and the thousand small intimacies that had been building between them for years. They talked about the future with careful optimism, about the challenges they would face, about the hope that maybe, just maybe, love could find a way. And when David finally prepared to leave as dawn approached, neither of them was the same person who had begun this evening. They were two people who had found in each other something they hadn't even known they were looking for. Connection that transcended age and circumstance and all the reasons why it shouldn't work. "I'll call you tomorrow," David said as he stood at the door, fully dressed but reluctant to leave. "I'd like that," Sarah replied, her hand lingering on his as he reached for the door handle. "Sarah," he said, turning back one last time, "I love you. Not as Marcus's friend, not as someone who's confused or going through a phase. I love you as a man loves a woman, completely and forever." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered, and saying the words aloud felt like stepping into a new life. After David left, Sarah stood in her doorway watching his car disappear into the early morning mist. The house behind her was the same house she had woken up in yesterday. But everything felt different now. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of possibility. She thought of the challenges ahead, of the conversations she would have to have, of the new chapter she was about to begin. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. She was ready to embrace it, to see where this unexpected love would take her. As she closed the door and headed upstairs, Sarah smiled. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, love really does find a way. The rain had stopped, and through her bedroom window, she could see the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds, painting the world in shades of gold and promise. It was going to be a beautiful day.